Good morning and welcome everybody, and we eagerly continue the conversation we have done yesterday at the first part of the eco-frictions panel. We are organizing with Mara Benaduzzi, and we move directly, I think, to the presentation that are scheduled with only an announcement. That is that the first speaker has withdrawn from participating, so we don't have the paper of Dino Palumbo that is unfortunately unable to reach the AAA this year. And we have only 3 presentations. We have another withdrawal. That is the last paper. So instead of having 5 papers, we have actually only 3 papers. And I present the speakers, including the 3 presenters that are, the first will be Tara Jolie from the University of Aberdeen, who's here. And then we will have Joseph Bosco from the Chinese University of Hong Kong, who is there, close to Mara. And the third presentation will be by Andrew Carey from the University of New Mexico. Then we have the pleasure to have the discussion paper of Douglas Holmes. Sorry, Douglas.
Rogers.
Sam? Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Sorry. Doug Rogers, sorry, from the Yale University. And I think we will move to the presentation, and I give the floor to Tara. I invite Tara to reach the podium. I think that you can do it from there, I think, as well. I don't know.
I'll stand, yeah.
If you prefer.
Okay. Can everybody, ooh, wow, yes, you can hear me. Thanks to all of you for coming so early this morning. Before I begin, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge and respect the fact that we're visitors on the traditional territory of Algonquian peoples around the Potomac and Anacostia rivers, including the Piscataway and their other Algonquian neighbors. Now I have to get used to all this technology. Okay. So this paper is based on my work since 2013 with the Fort McMurray Métis community, whose homeland in northeastern Alberta, Canada, is also the epicenter of oil or tar sands extraction, which is pictured here. And some of you may be familiar with this area due to the international attention it's received. In this paper, I will first discuss some of the problems with oil sands land reclamation. Then, using 3 ethnographic examples of gift exchanges, which I hope will build or layer on top of each other, I'll describe competing ways reclamation sites are represented by Indigenous people and oil companies. I play off the oil company rhetoric, which frames reclaimed areas as a kind of sustainable gift given to Indigenous people. And I'll conclude that this gift represents a reproduction of settler-colonial relations. The Alberta government requires that oil sands companies reclaim land disturbed by their extractive activities. Reclamation begins after mining ends. It involves moving or burying toxic tailings, contouring the land, and reestablishing vegetation to create a self-sustaining boreal forest. However, reclamation is different from pure restoration, which seeks to return a site to its original ecological function and structure. Instead, reclamation attempts to create a site that will support certain valuable land uses, such as cattle ranching, commercial forestry, or Indigenous land uses of hunting, trapping, fishing, and plant gathering. Reclamation is criticized by natural scientists who have shown that reclaimed sites represent a net loss of biodiversity and stored carbon compared to the pre-mined landscape. Indigenous communities are also largely skeptical of reclamation efforts, as they see the impacts of oil sands development as too significant to allow them to hunt, fish, or gather in reclaimed sites. Now, despite these criticisms, oil companies frequently cite reclamation in their environmental impact assessments, or EIAs, as a key mitigation strategy for the loss of Indigenous peoples' use of the land. Companies often go so far as to argue that reclamation will reverse impacts to Indigenous land uses. This perspective does not take into account the significant changes to the landscape, nor the fact that Indigenous communities are dispossessed from lease areas during the lifespan of an oil sands project. Now, because projects can operate for 50 to 100 years, and people are not on these leases for generations, there are few opportunities for intergenerational knowledge transfer on these sites. As anthropologist Clint Westman asks, when a mine closes and reclamation areas are given back to Indigenous communities, who will be the cultured and socialized individuals who will return? Where will they have learned the skills and values to practice Indigenous land uses effectively? So this gift of reclamation, which will reverse the impacts of development, is of course incompatible with Indigenous notions of gift giving within a sentient environment. So following Marcel Mauss, gifts are mechanisms for building social relationships and responsibilities. Classic subarctic ethnographies describe how these gift relationships are formed between human and non-human beings. Gifts are part of a system of reciprocity, often glossed as a benevolent giving environment. However, as Natiste illustrates, in some northern contexts, reciprocity can be either positive or negative, which can lead to either forging or sometimes negating relationships. In August 2014, I attended a medicinal plant harvest with my Métis friend and scholar, Sarah Ludit. We were harvesting rat root, which is known as Wakaskamiskawin in Cree, which is a common medicine used for aches and colds in northeastern Alberta. Before we dug into the mud to retrieve the roots, Sarah gave an offering of tobacco to the earth and uttered a prayer of thanks, a ceremonial gift. Sarah told me how these gifts of tobacco and prayer are a way of ensuring reciprocal relationships of care with the land. Because a gift is given, the medicine will be stronger and the plant will return and grow back more plentifully the following year. The plants hear the prayer, she said, and respond with their own gifts. Métis elder and anthropologist Elmer Ghostkeeper uses the word, now I'm gonna mess this up, so any Cree speakers, please correct me, Mekiakachkwawin, a Cree term for spirit gifting, to describe ceremonies such as the one Sarah performed. In a spirit gifting ceremony, the land and all of its inhabitants, including humans, are seen as spiritual beings who can enter into good relationships with each other. Métis community members have told me that offerings to the land must be given in areas that are clean or undisturbed by development. Some Métis people have told me that because of widespread oil sands development in the region, it's increasingly difficult to find a clean spot to practice these ceremonies. Oil sands extraction is understood as an activity that destroys the spirit in the land, limiting the ability of the offering to be received. From this view, environmental impacts of oil sands development are not only material, but felt spiritually and relationally as well. On another occasion, Sarah expressed to me that the spirit is missing, as she said, from reclamation activities. There's a need, she affirmed, not only to construct material ecosystems, but to create opportunities for cultural resurgence. Reclamation then becomes a task, in part, of reestablishing the spirit in the land and reforming relationships of positive reciprocity that have been broken. Land-based practices like Mekiakachkwawin can help achieve this relational healing of land, individual, and communities. However, there are little opportunities for Indigenous peoples like the Métis to visit reclamation sites or to be involved in reclamation activities. Because most reclamation areas are on oil sands leases and therefore closed to the public, the main or sometimes only opportunity for Indigenous community members to engage with these areas is through company-run tours. I attended one such tour in September 2014 with leaders of Indigenous communities across the region. The tour was called the Aboriginal Reclamation Advisory Committee Tour. Our group was bussed around the oil sands lease, stopping at a reclamation area that's closed to the public, which is pictured here. During our stop, the company's CEO gave a speech applauding the company's positive environmental work in the region, and conveniently not providing time for dialogue. company representatives gifted each community leader with a golden shovel engraved with the company logo. The leaders used the shovels to plant a few native seedlings of dogwood, white spruce, and black spruce. A photo was taken, pictured here, for the company's sustainability report, which was printed with the following caption. As part of the company's 50th anniversary, a special ceremony was held to unveil a plaque for the naming of one of their newer reclamation areas, called New Beginnings. Since 2009, bioengineering has been used rather than traditional reclamation methods, making it the largest area of its kind in the oil sands region. This company's ceremony was a far cry from Mikiakachquawin. Instead, the shovels were part of a larger performance of reclamation that I call a spectacle, which is following geographer Shiloh Krupar's definition that spectacles are visual and material commodification and alienation of human environmental engagement in a capitalist society. The gift of the golden shovel represents a corporate social responsibility ethic that frames industrial impacts as technological problems that can be resolved with the help of scientific advancements or new technologies to leave a positive legacy for land and communities. In their exhibitions of reclamation sites, such as on company tours, companies present a utopic vision of the future. The future is presented here as a new beginning or a progressive break from an industrial past in which human environmental relations were destructive and indigenous people were removed from their territory. So to elaborate with a final example, returning to the company tour after the golden shovels were distributed, oil company employees handed out boxes of cigarettes to indigenous community members. Like in offerings to medicinal plants, a gift of tobacco is commonly presented to elders in exchange for their gift of knowledge or stories as an act of reciprocity. However, it's important to note that no knowledge was actually sought from community members on this tour, and it was very much a one-way monologue presented by oil companies. So the 5 McMurray Métis elders who I sat with during this giving of cigarettes politely refused the gift. They said, "We don't smoke." I was not surprised by their refusal. The Métis community in Fort McMurray often uses gifts other than tobacco to honor elders. Indeed, many of the elders don't smoke, and some actually find that gift disrespectful. Yet there was still something unsettling about the cigarettes. After the company representatives walked away, the Métis elders laughed at the absurdity of the gift and expressed their disapproval of a spiritual tradition losing its meaning and being trivialized. "Hey, here's some smokes," they teased quietly, mocking the gift. The cigarettes were seen in part as an appropriation of ceremony. So the gift of tobacco, like the gift of golden shovels, embodies a spectacle of corporate social responsibility. Marxist scholars argue that a component of the spectacle is recuperation. And this is a process through which ideas that conflict with the capitalist system, like indigenous ontologies, are trivialized and then incorporated into said capitalist system. The cigarettes represent an incorporation of indigenous ceremonies in a way that creates an appearance of ethical participation. These ceremonies incorporate concerns about involving indigenous people in reclamation into the status quo, and in fact leave indigenous industry relationships unchanged. Yet in their refusal of the cigarettes, Métis community members do not simply passively accept this gift of reclamation. Marcel Mauss has stated, to refuse to give or to fail to invite, like refusing to accept, is a refusal of friendship and intercourse. But it's more than just breaking relationships. Mohawk anthropologist Audra Simpson articulates how refusal is also a hopeful and willful act of rejecting institutional structures and the logics of settler colonialism in order to assert an alternative, more equitable relationship between indigenous people and settler states or industries. Therefore, in this seemingly small acts of refusal, indigenous people are in part voicing a collective hope for a new relationship and a new way of doing reclamation, one in which their understandings of reciprocity are taken seriously and woven into reclamation practice in a more meaningful way. So I'll conclude with a final thought on healing. Many Métis individuals told me that they are the people who dwelled in the region before the oil sands were developed, and they will be the ones who remain once companies leave. The fact that the Métis remain on this land, even after being pushed away from oil sands lease areas and facing significant environmental damage to their territories, shows that they still see the land as being worthy of care. As Cree scholar Erica Violet Lee has beautifully said, when Indigenous peoples practice ceremonies in areas that settlers have discarded, or when they make a home in lands and bodies considered wastelands, they attest that these places are worthy of healing. The gift of reclamation, as given by oil companies to Indigenous peoples, silences stories of Métis dispossession on oil sands leases, and the reclaimed landscape does not allow for the renewal of these relationships at present. Gifting reclaimed land is thus entangled with a historically contingent settler colonial process that seeks not to establish reciprocity in the sense of Makiakachkwawin, but rather to erase Indigenous presence on the land, trivialize ceremonial practices, and thus further recreate settler space. Oil sands reclamation will only be considered successful to Indigenous communities if it takes seriously the industry's entanglement in an ongoing history of Indigenous dispossession from their lands. Reclamation must also acknowledge how environmental damage is more than just material, but also disrupts reciprocal relationships to a sentient environment. Reclamation then must involve a relational element of healing for both the land and Indigenous peoples. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tara, also for being perfectly on time within the 15 minutes so we established, or even earlier, 40 seconds left. And I think we can take a couple of minutes for one or two questions, very precise, if you have any, or from the floor, please.
I haven't personally encountered any leaders that say no. I think at that particular tour, I think all of the communities were represented actually in the region, which is pretty significant. I think, at least in terms of the McMurray Métis community, that's the only one that I can really speak to. I've heard a lot of resignation about development. So they say, oh, you know, this is gonna happen anyways. It's been happening since the 1960s. You know, we're facing this onslaught, like just crazy rapid development. And so participating in these processes is one way for them to at least show up to the table, is kind of what they say, and to have their voices heard maybe somehow, and to show that they're willing and that they want to move towards something that looks more like an equitable co-management kind of situation, even though what's happening now is a far cry from that. Yeah, I don't know if that.
Please.
So I'm just kind of curious. You're using Marcel Mauss's framework of reciprocity, but it really reminded me also, or I was wondering if you thought through Gregory Bateman's essay on culture contact and schismogenesis.
Mm-hmm.
With his definition of symmetrical versus complementary schismogenesis and then his own definition of reciprocity, and sort of this idea maybe of exchanging gifts and denials between these two groups as a way of establishing a different form of reciprocity.
Ooh. Well, I haven't read that paper, but thank you for that. Yeah, this is part of a paper that I'm hoping to publish, so thank you. I really appreciate that, and I will read that and try to incorporate it. Yeah, thanks.
Oh, there is another one out there.
Yeah.
Please.
So I thought this was very interesting. This is a similar situation in my own work. And I was just curious, whenever you have a situation like that, where a native sacred site or ceremonial site is being contaminated with something, I think it's always an interesting question to ask, why is this specific thing contaminating as opposed to other activities that might be done on the land? So do you have a sense of how oil in specific terms was something that was considered to disturb it in such a way that operates to be done there? What was it specifically about oil?
So what I presented today was pretty much the majority of what I have on that topic. It's not something that the community talked about super openly, and I found it difficult to have these conversations. So I can speak to one of my friends, Janelle Baker. She's a PhD student at McGill University, and she's working on the idea of contamination with berries. And she talks about how there's something about that extractive nature of the industry that breaks this relationship of reciprocity, in that companies are taking without giving back. And she's heard this from Cree elders of the Fort McKay First Nation. And I also want to add that idea of the clean spot it has to do with extractive activities, but also other industries like forestry or road development, all of those infrastructures that come along with extraction. So it's not necessarily just the mine or just the well pad where I'm hearing that kind of thing, yeah. Cool, thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. I don't see if there are any other, but I would, while we are relatively relaxed in terms of time, because we have two cancellations, but I suggest we keep the structure of 15-minute presentations and then a couple of minutes of discussion, and we have a final discussion at the end. So I invite the next speaker, Joseph Bosco, to present his presentation. I say the title because is there in the title there? Yeah, great. So I don't need to say, okay, just eco-friction in Taiwan, pesticides, profits, and heritage preservation.
Thank you. Taiwan has also been known as Formosa, the Portuguese word for beautiful, because the explorers in the 16th century called the lush and green island Ilha Formosa, beautiful island. Japanese colonialism from 1895 to 1945 developed the island as an agricultural region focused on producing sugarcane and rice. Until the 1960s, Taiwan was still a primarily agricultural economy. Land reform and import substitution industrial policies in the 1950s laid the foundation for economic growth. In 1960, Taiwan abandoned import substitution policy and began implementing an export-oriented economy. Industry grew rapidly, and this led to a shortage of labor in agriculture as young people left the farms for higher-paying jobs in factories. In the late 1960s, gasoline-powered rice transplanters and harvesters became common. They were needed to replace the missing farm workers. It was also in the 1960s that farmers began using chemical pesticides. Buying and spraying the chemical was cheaper than hiring laborers to weed by hand. Pingtung County's subtropical climate in southern Taiwan, the excellent irrigation and drainage, and good soils made it one of the richest agricultural regions in Taiwan. This is where I conducted fieldwork, specifically in Wandan Township. Farmers in other parts of the island complain that they cannot compete with Pingtung farms. Nevertheless, farmers in Pingtung also complain that they can barely make a living as farmers because crop prices are low and costs and risks are high. Most young people have left agriculture, leaving mostly older villagers of the grandparents' generation in farming. The use of chemical fertilizers and improved seed varieties had already been introduced in Taiwan under Japanese rule in the 1920s and 30s, but the introduction of pesticides in the 1960s had dramatic effects. Men born in the 1950s remember that as young boys, they were able to catch frogs and small mosquito fish in irrigation ditches for fun and to supplement their diet. But by the 1980s, the chemical pesticides had killed off the fish and amphibians in irrigation ditches and also seriously reduced the number of birds, especially white egrets. Rural residents noted these changes in the 1980s, but viewed it as an inevitable part of progress and development. Taiwan is still a beautiful island, but environmental damage is widespread. Factories from industrial zones have dumped heavy metals and other chemicals into rivers, and some of that water contaminated agricultural land. More and more agricultural land has been converted to industrial and residential use, creating a landscape that breaks up fields, reduces ventilation, disrupts drainage, and makes farming even more difficult. Now, there's two views of farming. The vast majority of farmers I interviewed feel that Taiwan's subtropical weather makes it impossible to farm without pesticides. Some of them resort to expensive net rooms like these to fight the pests. In fact, organic farming in Taiwan represents less than 1% of total output. And while some organic products are sold in supermarkets, the organic food market held each Saturday morning in Pingdong City is tiny. Only about a dozen stalls. This small role for organic farming is not due to lack of knowledge or effort. The government has been promoting organic agriculture since 1986, and although some argue that government efforts have been half-hearted, there's plenty of publicity and information about organic methods. Many farmers simply believe that farming is not feasible without pesticides. Broadly generalizing, we can identify two views of farming. One is the modernist view that emphasizes control over all factors and elimination of all pests. Chemical fertilizers and pesticides are used to maximize crop output. This perspective was adopted at a time when belief in science and technological progress was high. The extreme form of modernist agriculture is hydroponics, where crops are grown in an artificial medium in water, and all nutrients are controlled and provided artificially. Pesticides have been in common use in Taiwan since 1962, and the term 惯习农法, or customary agriculture, refers to farming that relies on chemical pesticides. Today, no one remembers farming before pesticides. The other view of farming we can call organic or relational. It has only gradually emerged, starting in the 1990s. It argues that crops are best grown in a complex natural environment where micronutrients and bacteria and even insects and fungi contribute to the health and productivity of the crop. Anna Tsing shows in her recent book this relational view is increasingly common in biology itself, challenging the view of evolution of single species and emphasizing the interdependence of species and the evolution of entire ecosystems. Tsing gives the example of the matsutake mushroom, which only grows well in the presence of pine and oak, in the unstable human-created forest known as Satoyama woodland. The root of matsutake, pine, and oak are connected, and it's this connection that benefits each plant synergistically. Thus, both the modernist pesticide-using system and the relational or organic system use science to support their approach. Yet there's a sense of crisis in customary farming with pesticides. Farmers are aware that they have to spray more often than in the past. The pesticides are not as effective as before, both because pests develop resistance and because the government is lowering allowable dosages. Organic agriculture in a subtropical environment like Taiwan is difficult. There is no winter freeze to kill off insects, and weeds grow very rapidly, often overwhelming crops. In addition, a number of new pests have been introduced to Taiwan, pests that do not have any natural predators. For example, large African snails introduced in the 1970s as potential food escaped and became an island-wide pest. Nevertheless, Taiwan has a small minority of farmers who argue that agriculture using industrial chemicals is not sustainable, and they promote various forms of organic and natural farming, touting their benefits for tastier and healthier food and for healthier and sustainable environment. These ideas about organic farming are very much linked to a worldwide green movement, especially flowing to Taiwan via Japan. The idea of natural farming, 自然农法, is widely known in Taiwan. It involves allowing crops and fruit trees to grow amid weeds and other vegetation, with the argument that the soil fertility and humidity is best preserved with natural vegetation. This philosophy was popularized by a Japanese apple farmer whose example is widely known in Taiwan. In Pingdong, one almost needs to be fanatical to pursue organic farming. Thus, it is perhaps not surprising that about half of the organic market's farmers are motivated to grow organic food by strong religious values. Some are evangelical Christians. One group, New Canaan, is affiliated with the Mount Zion New Testament Church, a Pentecostal religious group that claims that the real Mount Zion is actually in Taiwan. Other farmers are motivated by Buddhist teachings. They argue that humans need to share their crops with wild birds and other animals. Two such farmers refuse to kill large African snails, but collect them and release them on neighboring riverbanks. There's also an NGO that I'm calling Green Vision, which runs a demonstration farm and an organic food restaurant. The farm is seen as an integrated unit, using animal manure and ash from trees to circulate nutrients that are naturally available, and accepting that there will be some crop losses to wild animals, and not seeking to completely eliminate these animals. Indeed, Green Vision does not accept the term pest, saying that it is a biased term and that all animals have a right to exist. This farm is operated to demonstrate sustainable farming and to try to show that organic farming is possible in both an agricultural and economic sense. But the director recognizes that his environmental farming is less productive. For example, in 2015, organic farmers were only harvesting as little as 1/3 as much as the conventional farmers. Prices would need to be 3 times higher to compensate the farmer, but this is not always the case. Showing that organic farming can be profitable is important for Green Vision, but they are not primarily driven by profit. Both the director and his farm manager stressed the idea that it was better to only get enough, quote in quotes, and not to seek to maximize production. Indeed, the members I interviewed were very critical of the self-seeking, arrogant, and greedy mainstream culture that they see driving farmers to try to maximize their income at the cost of the environment. Now, I don't have time to fully discuss the issue of profit-seeking, but let me simply say that farmers deeply resent the assumption of urban consumers that farmers should be willing to accept crop losses due to insects and birds, like these birds, and do not accept the view that they are greedy when they misuse, in quotes again, from their point of view, the pesticides to protect their crops. Now, nostalgia and heritage preservation. Many farmers now in late middle age think back with nostalgia to what they think of as simpler times, when they could catch frogs and fish for fun and food. When combined with widespread fear that pesticides are poisoning farmers' bodies and damaging the environment, and that pesticide residues on food are poisoning consumers' bodies, many residents of Pingdong are interested in green alternatives. With the end of martial law in 1987, there came an explosion of interest in local history throughout Taiwan. In Wandan, Teacher Lee organized the Wandan Local Culture Collecting Society, including a number of local intellectuals, businessmen, and artists. They published a local history book and began holding annual events, such as the Sugarcane Festival, to teach young people about what had been the major commercial crop of the area at the time of their grandparents. That it's now no longer grown at all in the area. They also held events such as the Lightning Bug Festival in the mid-1990s to promote ecological awareness. By then, lightning bugs were rarely seen. The festival included releasing thousands of bugs that had been bought from suppliers in more remote mountainous areas of Taiwan. Larger political forces also influenced the local history fever throughout Taiwan. The end of martial law removed restrictions on the studying of local history, debates about Taiwanese identity increased curiosity about history, and rapid social change made people aware that traditions were disappearing. But a major force for nostalgia and for interest in heritage preservation came from the ecological changes brought about by pesticides. This nostalgia for an earlier and simpler time extends to other critiques of modern life, even many people's obsession to work long hours. The manager of the demonstration farm I just mentioned, a man of about 30 years of age, told me that the farm actually does not require a huge amount of work. Many days, he said, he only works 2 hours a day. During planting and harvest time, he will be busier, but mechanization has reduced the work of rice farming. This is a complete opposite of the modernist view that hard work and efficiency will lead to growth, prosperity, and a strong nation. This NGO Green Vision represents not only a critique of the misuse of pesticides, but also of the industrial economy, of industrial modernity itself. The return to the land, nostalgia for the past, emphasis on getting enough in quotes, and not the maximum, all contradict the ethos that drove Taiwan's growth in the 1960s to the 1980s. This nostalgia for an earlier time, for an agricultural society, and for the land is also reflected in the type of organic farm run by relatively wealthy individuals. Some of these farms are set up in part to promote organic farming. For example, the wife of a wealthy doctor has planted lychee nuts in an organic orchard. But she's also planted more than a dozen other varieties of fruit trees for her own consumption and enjoyment, as she admits. And she has a small house on her land that it's like a Russian dacha, allowing her to be with nature and to entertain her friends. These farms may break even or maybe make some money, but they are not primarily economic ventures. Thus, the interest in and hope for organic agriculture outstrips the reality. In conclusion, the organizing statement for this panel suggests that as a result of environmental crises, multiple and often conflicting moral regimes of economic systems are creating friction zones that are gradually bringing about change as a result of two phenomena. And here I quote, one that entails the reevaluation of cultural natural heritage, producing rhetorical, pragmatic, and political manipulations of the past. The other that features sustainable environmental renewal, promoting an alternative use of natural resources, end of quote. The panel statement refers to a contradiction in which the preservation of heritage focuses on the local, while the ecological discourse focuses on a universalistic safeguarding of the planet. In the Taiwan case, however, the two overlap. Saving local heritage and farmland is viewed by activists as necessary for saving sustainable agriculture locally, and for saving the island of Taiwan, and indeed the entire planet. In Taiwan, the activists promoting an understanding of local heritage are also promoting organic agriculture. Anna Tsing's theory of friction argues that global or universal ideas have to be engaged in sticky locations, which therefore affect how these ideas are realized, and then in turn affect those ideas on the global level. The concept of friction is intended to help us see local cultural configurations as reacting to global forces and concepts, and then changing those global forces and concepts in turn. In this paper, I have described how both conventional farming with pesticides and a green movement have arisen, both based on global ideas and forces, but taking on local characteristics. The attempts by both conventional and organic farmers to devise a system of tropical farming that uses less or even no industrial pesticides may become a solution to tropical agriculture that will then further influence agriculture in other tropical countries. Taiwan, as part of its attempt to forge its own international relations, hosts hundreds of students from developing countries, and in this way hopes to impact global tropical agriculture. The story is not over. Experiments and research continue. The gulf between modern pesticide-based farming and organic farming is large in a conceptual sense. In practice, however, there is some rapprochement. Farmers are willing and interested in reducing pesticide use because it's a cost for them. But they will not eliminate pesticides if they feel doing so endangers their crop. Government regulations have banned the more toxic pesticides and have gradually reduced the recommended concentration of pesticides that are allowed. For some crops, such as dragon fruit, the no poison production is common and feasible. For others, like mangoes, however, farmers say that pesticides are absolutely necessary. This paper has shown that the organic farming and conventional farming bring into conflict two broad sets of widely agreed upon goals for agriculture in Taiwan: ecological sustainability and healthy food on one hand, and maximizing production for farmers' profit and national food autonomy on the other. Organic farmers claim that they are maximizing production in the long run because industrial pesticides are damaging the soils and the environment and are not sustainable. Conventional farmers argue that when used properly, pesticides are perfectly safe and allow Taiwan to produce food to feed itself and to earn a profit by exporting high-quality fruits and vegetables. Balancing safety and production is difficult because of the different assumptions behind the green and conventional farmers' views of agriculture. And in a sense, both views present a fantasy. The modernist fantasy that industrial chemical use is sustainable and can feed the world, and the green fantasy that pesticide-free or organic agriculture can still feed us with the variety and quality of foods that we now enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this presentation that really has responded to the number of issues raised by the call, and also especially the conclusion, I think, suggests further elaboration of a number of issues we raised in the call, and how this paper reacted to that. Thanks very much. And are you the author of the pictures? Are you the author of that? That's great, wonderful. I'm impressed about the quality and the beautiness. Thanks. So I give to the floor the opportunity to raise one or two small questions before we move to another presentation. The last one. Any question? Imagine that I don't see nothing. Imagine that I am like, yeah, thank you for your help.
Yeah, so fascinating paper. I thought there was an interesting sort of teaching here with the idea that people, what you said earlier about how people can't remember agriculture before chemicals, right? And then later on, that the organic farmers view this as sort of nostalgic return to the past, right? Those seem to be in tension. So I suppose my question is, do you view these organic farmers as sort of a continuation of pre-industrial practices, or is this sort of a reinvention and novel form of agriculture that they're sort of mapping onto the past and saying, oh, this is like the past, but it's not actually a continuation of the pre-industrial agricultural practices?
Yeah, thanks. That's a good point. There is a tension there, which I perhaps didn't appreciate enough. So I appreciate your raising it. No, I think that they actually combine the view that it's traditional and they're using the nostalgia, but on the other hand, they are really emphasizing that this is modern, that this is the modern scientific way of doing agriculture, and that it has long-term benefits. And of course, they also recognize that there are a number of new pests that they have to address today, so they couldn't really use old methods anyways. And none of the farmers, so most of the organic farmers are actually among the few who are actually relatively young of the farmers. So they themselves have never experienced pre-chemical pesticide farming. So there's an interesting combination of the two. They're using the nostalgic benefits of this is traditional, but they're actually also claiming that it's modern, and they in fact, things like net rooms, and a number of they use organic chemicals, if you will, certain other products that are modern. So they definitely see themselves as modern.
There's a question there. Please.
Oh, the NGO? Yeah, so it was set up by a high school
in one
teacher.
sentence. Not that would be probably.
They're intellectuals, let's put it that way. Yeah.
Okay.
Very short.
No, because I saw someone else also. Any question from the table here for Joseph? No, we moved then to the next speaker. Sorry for frustrating that, but hopefully we're going to have time to discuss at the end of the. In fact, this is the final presentation. So I invite Andrew Carey to the podium to present his paper entitled, as a new title, in fact, comparing to the one in the program, and the new title is Eco-Fiction and Political Manipulation in the Struggle to Save Pyramid Lake. You don't have a presentation, so we can perhaps please.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's no
Floor
slideshow.
is yours. Sorry, I was looking at that here and I'd seen another picture here.
That's it.
But this, please.
Okay, my paper, Eco-Friction, Political Manipulation and the Struggle to Save Pyramid Lake. Okay, and this example of eco-friction involves conflict over the waters of the Truckee River in western Nevada. Known locally as the Truckee River Water Wars, this paper follows the Pyramid Lake tribe's long struggle over water with the Nevada Group, a coalition of western Nevada water users. This conflict follows the settler colonialism pattern of moving resources from indigenous peoples to incoming settlers, but the tribe was eventually able to turn the tide and reach an agreement that satisfied the majority of the parties involved. In the 1850s, the United States government was trying to reduce tensions by establishing reservation homelands for Indian peoples away from established immigrant trails. And so in November 1859, the Pyramid Lake Paiute Indian Reservation was set aside at the request of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, or the BIA. The northern Paiute people had long fished there, and Pyramid Lake was sacred and featured prominently in their creation story of the Stone Mother. The decline of mining in the West and hard times for farmers in the eastern U.S. led to a depression in the 1880s. Federal efforts to open up western lands to agriculture failed due to the harsh desert environment, and populist sympathy for more dramatic federal intervention grew. President Roosevelt was able to use his progressive agenda to pass the Reclamation Act in 1902 to support western agriculture. The Reclamation Act authorized massive government funding of dams and irrigation projects and established the Bureau of Reclamation. The first project authorized was the Truckee-Carson, later renamed Newlands Reclamation Project in 1903. Reclamation engineers asserted that the Truckee River, which feeds Pyramid Lake, had excess water that was wasted by allowing it to flow into the lake. Okay. Nevada Senator Newlands asserted that Pyramid Lake existed only to satisfy the thirsty sun. In 1905, Derby Dam began diverting water into the Truckee Canal to carry it to the Newlands project, where planners projected 350,000 acres of land could be reclaimed to make the desert bloom. However, alkaline soil and a shallow water table never allowed more than 74,000 acres to be put into production. The Paiute people were never consulted on this and noticed the decline in water flowing into Pyramid Lake. At times, no water was entering the lake, and the fish population began declining. They complained loudly to the Indian agent and BIA, who were responsible for representing the tribe's interests. Agent Lorenzo Creel protested to the Newlands project director, who informed him that the plans for the project did not allow any water to go into Pyramid Lake. They planned additional diversions to clean up any remaining wastewater, guaranteeing that there would be no permanent inflow into the lake. Under the Nevada law, water rights could only be used for beneficial use, quote unquote, uses such as mining, agriculture, or industry, or they would be forfeit. Fishing was not recognized as a beneficial use of water. The Paiute people still relied heavily on fishing, particularly the native Lahontan cutthroat trout, which was so abundant that over 100,000 pounds of fish from Pyramid Lake were transported by railroad to Sacramento, California in 1900. Decreased flow of the river combined with industrial pollution from sawmills, paper factories, and other industries in the Reno-Sparks area to devastate the fish population. And by the 1930s, fishing was no longer a viable economic activity for the Paiute people. The massive diversion of the Truckee River had other effects. Winnemucca Lake, a wetlands area 20 miles long and 3 miles wide, was also fed by the Truckee River. It had been designated a National Wildlife Refuge in 1936, but by the late 1930s had permanently dried out. Runoff from Newlands also created a new wetlands area below the project, the Stillwater Marshes, which was designated as a National Wildlife Refuge in 1949. With the election of Franklin Roosevelt and the Indian New Deal of 1933, the power to act moved from the Indian agent to the newly elected Pyramid Lake Tribal Council. And a study of the lake completed in 1938 revealed that the number of fish caught had declined by more than 60% over 3 years and continued to decline. The Lahontan cutthroat trout that had been so abundant was extinct by 1943. In 1944, the Ordich Decree allocated all of the water rights held on the Truckee River at that time and although it included a small allocation for Pyramid Lake agriculture, no water was provided to sustain Pyramid Lake or its fishery. In the 1950s, the Bureau of Reclamation announced the Washoe Project to build 2 new dams on the Upper Truckee River, Prosser Creek Dam and Stampede Dam. These were intended to store seasonal waters and water otherwise wasted during the spring runoff. Stampede Reservoir was larger and would impound and divert all the water to other users that Pyramid Lake had been receiving since 1905. The tribe opposed the project, citing damage that had already been done. Nevada congressmen pushing the legislation recognized the damage and included funding in the Washoe Project Act to help the fish, and specified that flows from Stampede Reservoir be made available to Pyramid Lake. The tribe, however, finally rejected the act because the law only promised to maintain, quote unquote, the largest practical flow into Pyramid Lake, which could be no water at all, and often was. The act passed and construction proceeded. Nevada water users and the United States paid little attention to the needs of the Pyramid Lake tribe, and passage of the Endangered Species Act in 1996, however, gave the tribe some leverage. Another species of fish indigenous to Pyramid Lake, the kiwi, was listed as endangered on the very first endangered species list of 1967. The listing was important because it required the Secretary of the Interior to take action to save the kiwi. Interior Secretary Stuart Udall initiated the first effort to control water use in the Newlands Project, known as the Operating Criteria and Procedures, or OCAP. However, later secretaries put little effort into enforcing these. The Pyramid Lake tribal members invoked their traditional identity as the Kwiwi Dakoto, or Kwiwi Eaters, to unite them in their effort to save Pyramid Lake. Tribal Chairman Joe Ely stated, "There are many significant aspects within the legend of the Stone Mother, but none as clear as the direct relationship between the Kwiwi, the people, Kwiwi Dakoto, and the lake, Kwiwi Pa. These 3 creations become the components that give name and identity to the Pyramid Lake tribe. If one of these components is lost, the identity from creation to an immemorial tradition is completely erased." For the Pyramid Lake people, this conflict was do or die, and they pushed 3 strategies to save the lake: winners' rights, the OCAP, and negotiation. In the meantime, the Nevada group continued their effort to cut off Pyramid Lake. The Truckee River originates in Lake Tahoe in California, so California had first access to all water. Nevada needed an agreement with California to ensure access to the river. The 2 states negotiated a bi-state compact in 1969 that completely ignored Pyramid Lake. Interior Secretary Stuart Udall opposed the compact, citing provision making it binding on the United States, which would prevent any federal support for the Pyramid Lake tribe's effort. Because of Udall's position, the bi-state compact never received a serious hearing or vote in Congress. To try to address the Pyramid Lake issue, California Governor Ronald Reagan, Nevada Governor Paul Laxalt, and Secretary of the Interior Walter Hickel met on a private yacht in the middle of Lake Tahoe in the summer of 1969. Rather than let Pyramid Lake decline, they decided to drain it to the point where the current flow would maintain it. The vertical level of the lake would be reduced 152 feet. This would kill the fish and destroy any economic value to the lake might have to the Pyramid Lake people. This proposal raised a huge outcry of outrage and was quickly dropped. Following this, the Pyramid Lake Government Task Force was formed to investigate ways to aid Pyramid Lake. A consultant who reviewed the water system noted that the Newlands project was wasteful and significant water could be salvaged with modifications and capital investment. However, the final report stated that no additional water could be found for Pyramid Lake, and any modifications might damage the Stillwater Wildlife Refuge. Okay. One note here, however, is that wildlife refuges, like fisheries, did not count as beneficial use under Nevada law. The tribe had filed a claim with the Indian Claims Commission under the 1908 Winters versus United States Supreme Court decision to get water for Pyramid Lake. Winters states that when an Indian reservation is established, water rights are reserved to accomplish the purpose of the reservation. The Pyramid Lake Tribal Council argued that since Pyramid Lake had been set aside for the fishery, the tribe was entitled to water rights to maintain it. In 1975, the Indian Claims Commission ruled that the tribe did hold a right for maintenance of Pyramid Lake and the fishery with an origination date of 1859. It also declared that the tribe's water rights were neither lost nor diminished and awarded the tribe $8 million for damages. With this, the tribe filed suit against the Truckee-Carson Irrigation District, TCID, which operates the Newlands Project, and all other 17,000 water rights users of the Truckee River to change the Ore-Ditch Decree and secure water to maintain the lake and restore the fishery. TCID members were outraged that a fish could be used to try to impinge on their water rights. The tribe lost in local district court, but won in the Court of Appeals against TCID only. However, the state of Nevada decided to support TCID and appealed to the Supreme Court. The state's lawyers argued in the case using the decision Heckman versus U.S., which states that when the U.S. litigates on behalf of an Indian tribe, the tribe is bound by the decision, whether the tribe supported or even wanted the legislation to begin with. The 1983 Supreme Court ruling Nevada versus U.S. favored TCID and stated that once such decisions regarding property were made, they should not be reopened, as it may damage other parties involved. Hence, the Pyramid Lake tribe is bound forever by the Ore-Ditch Decree. The Pyramid Lake tribe's second option was to force the federal government to enforce the OCAP by filing a lawsuit against the Secretary of the Interior. In his 1973 decision, Tribe versus Morton, Judge Gesell noted that TCID diverted enough water for the original proposed project area of 350,000 acres rather than the 74,000 acres actually under cultivation. The decision called for a new OCAP with an immediate reduction in Newlands project diversions. TCID refused to comply and continued diverting water as they had done for the past 60 years. Secretary Morton was then notified TCID that he was terminating the 1926 contract that authorized them to manage the Newlands project. TCID then filed suit claiming the Secretary did not have the authority to impose the OCAP or terminate TCID's contract. The suit went to federal court in Reno, where Judge Bruce Thompson sat on the case for 10 years, but finally ruled that Gesell's OCAP was valid and the contract was validly terminated. In those 10 years, TCID diverted 1,058,000 acre-feet of water in violation of Gesell's OCAP. Legally, this water would have to be returned to Pyramid Lake and is still unresolved today. Due to Stuart Udall's decision, from its completion in 1970, Stampede Reservoir had been operated exclusively for the benefit of Pyramid Lake and the restoration of the Kwiwi. Sierra Pacific Power Company argued that under the Washoe Project Act, the water in Stampede had been intended for municipal use and sued the United States to release the water for development. In 1982, Judge Solomon ruled against them, stating that the Endangered Species Act took precedence. This decision prevented the Nevada group from using the court system to get around the act. In 1986, Paul Laxalt, now senator, introduced legislation to ratify the long-dead Bi-State Compact, which would permanently end the disputes in the Nevada group's favor. The tribe hired a lobby group to oppose the bill, and the tribe managed to gain sufficient support to stop the bill and they offered a compromise. Laxalt called members of the Nevada group, but they rejected any compromise. Laxalt withdrew the compact, calling the situation the Middle East of the West. No water agreement could succeed without the involvement of Pyramid Lake. The following year, Joe Grimban, the head of Sierra Pacific Power Company, and Pyramid Lake Chairman Joe Ely met over a cup of coffee and worked out a compromise that involves sharing the water stored in Stampede Reservoir. Sierra Pacific only needed water for municipal use in drought years, roughly 2 and 7. Pyramid Lake would get the water for 5 of the 7 years to allow the Kwiwi to spawn naturally in the river. Both parties were pleased, and Grimban began to bring the rest of the Nevada group and the states of Nevada, California together to negotiate a comprehensive agreement. Senator Harry Reid, who had replaced Laxalt, offered to help. Negotiations should place TCID allocations at the level established by the Gesell decision, TCID argued that their traditional diversions benefited not only themselves, but the Stillwater Marshes and the city of Fallon. When other parties didn't agree, TCID withdrew from the negotiations. The other parties worked together and reached a final agreement. TCID effectively withdrew from the Nevada group, and the group reformed to include the Pyramid Lake tribe. With this, the Nevada group became environmentalists. Provisions in the agreement made both fisheries and wildlife refuges beneficial uses and guarantees water for Pyramid Lake and the Stillwater Wildlife Refuge. Water for the Kiwi is guaranteed even when they are removed from the endangered species list. This agreement went to Congress where TCID tried to stop it, but Senator Reed was able to push the legislation forward. The agreement was approved by Congress and signed by President Bush in 1990 as Public Law 101-618. Once the law was passed, another effort was made to bring TCID into the agreement. A professional mediator was brought in, and TCID put together a coalition of Lahontan Valley water users, the Lahontan Valley Environmental Association, to negotiate for them. However, they were not able to come to an agreement. The Nevada group had long been successful at pushing aside and ignoring Pyramid Lake people, and they remained united until all possible options had been expended. Only then were they open to compromise. They found they could only solve their problems by including the Pyramid Lake tribe, and it became in their best interest to become environmentalists. Friction over the waters of the Truckee River could not be completely resolved, though, as TCID is still brooding on the sidelines. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you very much. We invite you to make one or two short questions, if you have, before we move to the discussion paper. Any question for this presentation?
I have a question. Filippo, I'm here. Can
Oh,
I
you're
ask a
here.
question?
Sorry.
I know that he's quiet, you know. There is a light in your eyes that is disturbing a little. No, I was curious to understand what was your role as ethnographer in this struggle to save Pyramid Lake, what actually you did on the field, and what did you try to make advocacy, or what did you do?
Oh, my role as the ethnographer was actually recording was actually approaching it from the aspect of tribal sovereignty, what the Pyramid Lake tribe was able to do, using their role as a federally recognized Indian tribe, and what powers they had to actually stop TCID and the other members of the Nevada group from trying to, actually secure water for the lake. That was my role, but that didn't fit into, that wasn't part of the, I mean, it was part of the eco-friction, but it didn't seem to fit the call for papers.
Thanks.
Well, looking here, there is someone that has a question. So if there are no questions for this presentation, I invite Douglas to make his comment, his discussion paper on these three presentations we just had before we open to a more general discussion.
I wanted to begin by thanking Mara and Filippo for inviting me to comment on these terrific papers and to participate in this sort of bifurcated double panel. For those of you who didn't notice, the first session was yesterday, so there's sort of an ongoing conversation here that I don't want to get too much in the way of, and I hope we'll have time to talk about the way some of the papers from the different panels fit together as well. This was one of those wonderful call for paper abstracts, I remember very distinctly getting it, the invitation to be a discussant on this panel, and reading it, and I was immediately taken to a moment in my own fieldwork, which has been in the Russian Urals about oil companies, and some pieces of that has to do with heritage preservation. I was interviewing one day a sort of heritage activist, someone who'd become very interested in local cultural heritage, and I asked her how she got into this. And she said, have you been up to the north of the region in the salt mines? And I said, no, I haven't been there. She said, well, you have to go, because as you drive into one of these salt mining towns, salt mining cities really now, in the north of the Perm region of Russia, you drive right through these enormous tailings mounds. They look like, you know, human-made mountains. And she said, I drove through there the first time a few years ago, and then I realized what humans have done to this earth. And that was the moment she decided she was going to become interested in heritage and traditional folk crafts and the revival of ethnic cultures of various sorts in this region. And you know, it was a couple months later when I actually got to drive north to one of these towns, and she was exactly right. I had the same impression, and I was immediately taken back to that in reading this abstract. So I think this is, it certainly resonated for me as a theme, as a topic that's worthy of a lot of different kinds of investigation. And a lot of different kinds of theorization. I have to say, however, that the papers on this panel didn't actually narrow any of this down for me. It sort of expanded the interest in lots of new and interesting ways, and it was a delight to read them and engage with them. So I have just a few questions and sort of topics I wanted to bring out in each. In some cases, these are questions I had about the papers. In some cases, they're places where they sort of come together. And I'll try to wrap these around some general comments or sort of points of wonder anyway about some of the general topics of the double sessions. I'll take these in a slightly different order than we had them today. Joe Bosco first, who presents sort of a classic confrontation between modernist, profit-driven, labor-intensive agriculture using pesticides, and then a much smaller but quite visible and certainly activist organic farming movement in Taiwan. As he notes throughout the paper and especially at the end, this is not really a complete sort of dichotomy, or there are two visions, but there's moments of rapprochement between them. There's lots of sort of tie-ins and comparisons and intersections. And I wanted to ask about a couple more of them that seemed to be there, but I was curious about what else you might have to say about them. And one of them is that it really only came up right at the end of the paper, but certainly some of the modernist agricultural visions you talked about had this element of national food autonomy, which seemed to me a curious thing that could, at least for the purposes of that modernist agricultural goal, also cast it in some sort of traditional light about self-sustaining nationhood. I could imagine that kind of a discourse harkened back to a sort of time when there was food security, where we didn't depend on international kinds of connections or things like this. And I wondered whether that was a different way of framing heritage, but actually on the sort of modernist modernist agricultural production side. The second one that interested me here was your mention of religious connections to heritage on the organic farming side. Clearly, there's connections in the heritage connections there in the Buddhist example, probably less so in the, or at least potentially less so in the Pentecostal Protestant one. But I would guess that there's many people on the sort of modernist agricultural side who are also Buddhist, or who also have some connection to religious practice or religious ethics, and I wondered whether there's something to be excavated there as well. So this is just to say that although the heuristic you set up and the rapprochement between them works nicely, I thought there was so much more to say there that I was curious about it. I was also curious, and this will become clear a little bit as I talked about the next papers, about what was the role of the state in promoting organic agriculture, organic farming. You mentioned that the Taiwanese state is quite interested in this, but I wasn't quite sure why they were, and it certainly seemed that the Green Vision folks were not particularly state-supported or tied up with the state. They at least seemed more interested in international NGOs, the sort of connections with Japan, things like this. So if it's only 1%, if there's a national food autonomy, what is the state doing here, and what does that look like? One of the things that I thought this paper did very clearly for the whole panel in a wonderfully useful way is to draw our attention to the question of what is the difference between nostalgia and heritage, or the relationship between nostalgia and heritage. So, as a sort of seat of the pants kind of thing, heritage seems like a sort of much more elaborated, insistent, developed version of nostalgia, where nostalgia is sort of a much fuzzier sort of, the feelings you have of missing the fish and the frogs and the fun of youth, versus a much more elaborate program. And the way in which you talk about both things going on here seem to be a quite productive way into thinking about the heritage part of this panel's framing. So I thought that might be something we could talk about in conversation with the other papers. And then the fourth thing, of course, is the extent to which Green Division's farm works as a model farm, as a sort of spectacle farm. If we were to look at this in comparison with some of the other papers, this is in Mara's paper as well, the way in which some of these eco or environmental sustainable fantasies, if we go to the title of the panel, are encased in a particular kind of spectacle or in a particular kind of display. And I wondered whether is there actually a sort of tourist element to this? Do people go and check out this farm as tourists in a way that would resonate with some of the other papers? Is there a sort of connection with a kind of museumified or display or festival or element of what's going on there? So thanks, Joe, for a wonderful paper, and I hope to read more about this case. I'm going to go next to Tara's paper, and I also have 4 points here. This is a wonderful story and a really nice ethnography of what the different kinds of reclamation might mean, and how reclamation is not at all a transparent term. The discussion of this issue through anthropological and other theories of the gift seems to me just right and works very well. The oral presentation actually structured this in a much more deliberate way than the written one, and I liked it. I think it worked very well. It reminded me of I think your phrasing at one point is how this gift to the indigenous people reproduces settler colonial ideals, and it seems to me one of the ideals that reproduces from sort of older settler colonial days is that colonialism itself is a gift. So there's a much richer history there of gift giving, of colonialism as a gift of modernization or Christianity, or so I think there might even be more to talk about in that context. And if I could anticipate a little bit of a contrast with Andy's paper, this is a very corporate-focused story. And at least in this story, the state, Alberta here, appears only by requiring reclamation, as far as I remember. There's no other influence of the state here. The entire interaction and the gifts that are taking place are not about government representatives. There's no place for them here. They don't even appear to be at the shovel ceremony, as far as I can tell. It is a very sort of corporate responsibility, corporate story that I think that part of it might be emphasized a little bit more, because it is quite different from an earlier stage of colonialism, settler colonialism, I would guess, and certainly contrasts a little bit with the story that Andy tells. Bioengineering and reclamation. The caption on that photo, I think it was the photo with the shovels, right? Says something like the oil company is using, or this is the first place that the oil company is using bioengineering methods and, quote, not traditional methods. That's a fascinating phrasing, because clearly they're not saying we're using bioengineering rather than Métis traditional methods, right? I mean, that is your point, is that whatever they're doing, it's not the indigenous, but even in the discourse of the oil company, there's a modern method and a traditional method. There's sort of layers of their own version of heritage, which is whatever the pre-bioengineering version is. And the bioengineering itself seemed to me particularly interesting for what is going on there with bioengineering. And there was an excellent question from the audience about what is it about oil that is polluting of these places? What is it about bioengineering that is not what happened before? And what's going on at a much more micro level? That's not just company and métier, but various kinds of reclamation on the company side as well. Not just on the métier side. So that was great. And then the fourth point I wanted to make here was set in motion by your use of Audra Simpson's concept of refusal, which I think seems entirely correct and very useful way to think about the gift. I wonder, however, if once we're talking about refusal, whether friction really works. Is refusal a kind of friction? It doesn't really seem so. It seems like it's not friction. It's a stop. There's no rubbing here. The point is not to engage. Is settler colonialism itself a kind of friction? That might be kind of gentle for a lot of what settler colonialism is and was. So that put me in mind of thinking about, if friction is the center of what we're talking about, in Anna Tsing's version or others, what lies to the sides of friction? And one of them seems to be the limit case of refusal, right? Not even going on the tour, or not even accepting the gifts. And of course, here is another version of spectacle, although in this case not run by the state, not run by an NGO, but this bizarre image of the oil company giving the indigenous people a tour of their own land in a very limited way that you can see this place. So that's a great example of spectacle in this eco-fantasy of sustainability. So thanks for this paper. It was fascinating. Andy's paper on Pyramid Lake, a really reading this alongside the other papers, a great historical kind of view of the very long-term entanglement of state and corporation and PU people in Nevada, and it seemed to me worthwhile, since I got on this sort of state and corporation kick in the other papers, to think about the ways in which it might actually be useful to disentangle a little bit more of what, at different points, what kinds of state and federal and corporate interests are involved here, especially in the context of what you were mentioning in your answer to Mara earlier about sovereignty and the ways in which there may be indigenous corporations involved as well. That seems to be a sort of a productive way to sort of hook this into some other things. There's a wonderful story here, and it is delightfully complex in all of the different factions that were going on, and all of the negotiations. I mean, it's just to hold it together without even theorizing it is impressive. I thought you were going to have a.
Oh no, it's incredibly complex.
Yeah, right. I mean, you can see that, especially since, I mean, that's the virtue, the great virtue of seeing it over like 150 or 160 years is precisely that complexity. But I well appreciate how hard it is to hold it all together. This paper sort of presented to me this interesting question of how is it that we get to heritage? Like how are things preserved? This was in large part a success story, or at least in some part feels like a success. But what is the route to that success? And at least in parts of this, I wasn't quite sure because of all the factions and all the different laws at play. But at least for some part, there's this, at least for the PU people, the fish lake human triad that is so central to their understanding of things. But for at least some historical periods, it was the fish that enabled them to get into the preservation, right? It's the Endangered Species Act, it's the use of the fish and not some relationality. And after the fish, it seems to be something about the water. The humans, are not really the route into it. although they may be if there's a tribal sovereignty angle that you didn't talk about in this paper, but what are the roots of that triad that become mobilized at particular times for particular reasons, that become the focus of heritage, and are enabled by these larger state or corporate configurations, right? The Endangered Species Act and all that happens, and all of a sudden it opens a window for just for the fish part of that triad to be the key player. But then at another time it might shift. That seemed to be an interesting thing to keep our eyes on as we think about these larger issues. Something that is clear in all of these papers, was particularly stated here, was this issue of how what counts as beneficial keeps moving. And it was so wonderfully presented because in this case it's actual law, right? It's actually like beneficial counts as it benefits this or that. Not fish, not humans, not certain humans at some point, but then these things change. And at the end, it's fisheries and wildlife preservation that are useful, but nobody's counting heritage as a beneficial use, right? So what becomes beneficial and who says, seems like a productive thing to emphasize. And the last thing I'll say, as I said in response to Tara's paper, is this friction. It certainly seems like that's one of the things going on, but is the Middle East of the West and the Truckee River water wars, is this something more than friction or something else going on that's a little more dramatic, at least at times, than friction? So I will end on that point and just to say thanks for these papers, and I'm really looking forward to hearing all of you talk about them and link them to some of the papers yesterday as well. So thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Douglas, for engaging so usefully with all those papers and presentations. And I think now we have also being on time perfectly, you as well, and we have 15 minutes left for a discussion. I think the first thing would be good to give the presenters the opportunity to react to Douglas' comments and also question marks, and then we try to have a full discussion with the floor and opening and have the final comments. So I would give to the perhaps the first presenters, or Joseph or Tara, who wants to react.
We can follow the same order.
Okay.
From Joseph.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. We follow the same order.
To
Okay.
be brief, these are very useful comments. So on food autonomy as being modern, that's a very good point. I just want to emphasize that in Taiwan, there's still a very strong nation-building ethos, and so everything was done for hard currency. And so in the 1960s, Taiwan canned asparagus and exported those, and that was a major source of foreign currency. And the free market ideal of liberalism or neoliberalism simply doesn't fly. It's not the popular view. And so the idea today is exporting fresh vegetables and fruit. And so that's seen as helping the nation, helping the farmers. And so you're right. I mean, and food autonomy is impossible because Taiwan is much too densely settled. So they buy grains from overseas, but they hope to be able to produce the fruits and vegetables for themselves and to export for this food autonomy and modernism is still in this old view rather than the free market view. On the religious connections, that's a very good point. But I need to emphasize that in Taiwan's religion is really a folk religion, which includes Buddhism, Confucian ideas, and Taoism. And so when I'm talking about Buddhists, these are people who are actually becoming much more devout in a Buddhist sense. And so they are really motivated by religion. And then your point on I do view nostalgia as the emotional component, and and heritage can be something that it leads to. And so you're absolutely right. I look at it that way, as nostalgia, sort of not being related to heritage, but heritage then becomes the creation of a much more I don't want to say official, but complex and well thought out view of what the past was. So, but there is a difference, an important difference. And then how does Green Vision work as a model farm? So they encourage school groups to go visit. They have documentaries, reporters go there. They have a store at which they tell the story about the farm. And then they allow people like me to stay there for 48 hours, staying overnight. And they made it very easy to interview them. They spent hours with me, explaining the process. And they really do want to, they run it as a farm to show that you could run farms like this. That's really their goal.
Thank you.
Tried to be brief. So.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Please, Tara.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Oh my goodness. Thank you, Douglas, for those really thoughtful comments, incredibly helpful to think with. So I just want to comment on a few of them. The comment about the fact that the state was not present in my paper, this is very characteristic of Alberta. And it's something that myself and my colleagues who are working on this issue have been writing about, is that the state in Aboriginal consultation processes is very absent. And they delegate all of their responsibilities for consultation, which comes from the Supreme Court of Canada. It's embedded in law. They delegate all the procedural aspects to industry. So that means that industry is solely responsible for reaching out to communities. They have to report everything back to the government, but the government is very much hands off. And this is a problem for many reasons. And the second thing I want to comment on is this idea of oil companies having their own idea of heritage in terms of reclamation techniques. So another aspect of my work is with reclamation scientists. So I'm really interested in those exact questions. And one thing, just really briefly, that I'll say about that is that it's really interesting to see how techniques have changed over time and how that reflects in the materiality of the landscape. So, for example, the only certified reclaimed area, which is open to the public, was planted in the 1990s. And this means that they followed very different scientific cultures, I guess. And so there were non-native species planted there. They were not necessarily planted in the best way. And a lot of elders have gone there and they're like, why is this tree from Siberia here? Like, why did you not plant our native species? So things like that have changed over time, and I think that's just fascinating. And then finally, this idea about friction working. You'll notice that I didn't use friction in my paper, and I do find that the settler colonial analysis is stronger, I suppose. But this is something I'm going to think a little bit more about through the idea of refusal. Yeah, I do think that friction is useful in looking at places like the oil sands or the tar sands, because it allows us to look at these competing actors and how they kind of butt heads and come up against each other in different ways. But I do find, there is this broader picture of settler colonialism that's important to take into account. So thank you for that comment, and I'll leave it at that.
Thanks a lot.
All right, and thank you, Doug, for your comments. One thing that I wanted to address was the complexity of this, and it was immensely complex. And trying to get it down into something that was understandable in 15 minutes was really difficult. I had to cut out a tremendous amount of stuff, and I had it in there, and I thought, okay, I got to cut it, I got to cut this, I got to cut this, I got to cut this. Okay, we're going to get down to the brass, the really basics here, which is how it came out. Because there was a lot more interaction and going back and forth. The Indians were shut out, and I tried to get in there the idea of the sovereignty when the tribe was able to take control of defending the lake or trying to defend the lake with the IRA.
Right.
But that clearly didn't come through clearly enough because the Indian agent and the Bureau of Indian Affairs pretty much abrogated their responsibility and just let the irrigation district and other water users just take over. And made very little effort to do anything. And so the tribe began pushing when they got control, you know, but it took time for them to get politically astute enough to start really pushing. And that's when you started to see things like going through the Indian Claims Commission, going to going to the reserved right, winners' rights, pushing on the OCAP, and pushing on and finally pushing negotiations. Because one thing, for example, with the winners' rights, everything looked good. Everything looked like they had won against the Newlands Project, but then Nevada came in on the side of TCID because Nevada had everything it wanted, but it decided to support the white users against the Indians, and go to the Supreme Court where TCID won. And so one issue about that was that it was white people against the Indians, and this is something that came up all the time. It was white people against the Indians until the Indians were actually able to break the Nevada group, and that was only when all those court decisions finally came down on their side, you know. And the issue with you pointed out that the humans didn't count. Well, it was the Indians that didn't count.
Right.
You know, the Indians didn't count. You know, they were willing to sacrifice the lake and everything for their own you know, economic and advancement. And so when the tribe was able to get some leverage with the fish, they ran with it, and then that is when it was part of. You know, that's when they played the heritage card, I guess, and fell back. We are the Kwiwi eaters, the Kwiwi Dakota. The lake is the Kwiwi Pa, and we're going to save the Kwiwi, damn it, you know. And actually nobody thought they could pull it off. Nobody thought they could pull it off. In 1976, there was a guy named John Pilgar, who was a British investigative journalist, who says, these people actually think they can win. And he was in complete disbelief, you know. He thought, you know, this lake is gone, these people are gone, you know, you know, all in the name of American progress. And everybody was shocked when they actually were able to pull it off, you know. And so that was where but the Kwiwi Dakota, I saw that as the heritage, and then the friction was this friction over water, which, I mean, it's conflict, but it's a long-term conflict. So that's where I saw the friction issue, and so which is why I submitted the paper to the thing, you know, because it was long term, and I think that a lot of these issues are going to be long term. I think that it's not going to be short and easy. It's going to be, everything's going to take a long time, and I think that this may be just an example of something like that.
Yeah. Okay, thanks a lot. We still have 5 minutes. I suggest we give to the floor the opportunity to interact with our speakers. Please, I see a lady there. Please, if you want to present yourself.
Yeah. I don't know if you need to go to the mic or what, but so yeah, I was just picking up on the sort of nostalgia versus heritage thing at first.
Thank you.
So something that has bothered me about that kind of coming out of the post-socialist literature is it seems sort of, you know, classed or something. You know, nostalgia is these people who don't, you know, maybe know why they're doing this thing, and they're not organized, and they don't have the institutional, you know, maybe capacity to produce cultural capital or something. And I've also had a lot of issues kind of working with, you know, the Singh's friction framework in my own work too. So I mean, I'm wondering, you know, I'm moving towards just being like, I think I just want to attack this with, you know, Bourdieuian, you know, analysis of these different groups competing on different fields, you know. So I just was interested if anyone had any thoughts about that, because I think that's maybe a more, in some ways it's a more kind of, I think also putting the actors on a more neutral plane. And I see a lot of kind of people working on this stuff going towards settler colonialism, but to me that's also kind of just got this like inbuilt sort of, you know, good guys versus bad guys logic. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you for this comment. Thank you so much. Please.
Thank you for all these papers. They're great. I'm sorry that I missed the first part. So I'm very interested in, like, in the papers you talk about, for example, the state's role and the corporation's role, or like for example, the farmer's role. I'm very curious, like, I know the environmental sustainability problems has been here for a long time, and it's also repeated right now in other developing countries. So I'm very curious about how can other people, for example, the consumer's role, can play in these settings, and what can we do to really intervene these problems and really maybe how to say that, like, really encourage the state or the corporation to promote these environmental sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a question too,
Yeah.
if there is enough time.
I think
It's a comment.
I was just trying to inviting you to make a final comment for the conference, because we have just 1 minute. So if you want to transform your question to Joseph, and then we will have time to continue our discussion, perhaps around the coffee, because we have only 20 minutes to go to the next sessions, everybody, I think.
Okay.
So I want to give this privilege to Mara, because she is actually the real mind behind the all 2 sessions. So I would be delighted to give her the opportunity to close in a way with questions and comments, comments to comments, or whatever you like. Please, Mara.
The part of the papers of Joseph, when he was describing this nostalgia, how the past was, and I would add how we used to be at that time. And in my view, what I was wondering, organizing this panel with Filippo, is there is a conflict over the local politics of history and memory. So in your paper, I didn't have the chance to understand if local farmers even have a conflictual view on this past and nostalgia about how we used to be in the past. And regarding the general comment, it's really 1 minute is too. I can afford this challenge, but I was thinking that I am very interested in the way we govern the relationship between past, present, and future in these frictional zones. And in my view, what I found in the different papers is that the present disappeared. There is some sort of disappearance of the present, because all the efforts are concerned the past in terms of create these storerooms of imagination about the past that is stored in a sort of way, and there is an open conflict of who have to store the past and in which directions. And then the future is there, and there are different kind of manipulations of the future in order to intervene in the present through process of imagination, but also, I would say, anticipation and also preemption. So I'm afraid that the present in these cases remain like a space of dehistorifies. I don't know in English how we could pronounce it's a difficult word. In through the manipulation of past and present, the possibility to in a processual way intervene in the present is really reduced.
I think, thank you. I think this is really, I mean, it invites us to read De Martino, perhaps, yeah? Because the notion of dehistorification opens up new horizons towards an Italian anthropologist, well known in Italy, but not so well known in
now
in
translated,
we just
translated in English. So we invite you to read the book of this very nice anthropologist, Italian anthropologist, working in the middle of the 19th century, starting in the middle of the 20th century, Ernesto De Martino, that now is available also in English, and this concept of dehistorification is taken by De Martino.
Recently rediscovered, hopefully, by the US anthropology. Well, thanks everybody. Thanks so much for the presenters. Thank you so much to Douglas for his comments, and thank you so much for your comment, everybody, for being here. And we hope to continue this discussion on eco-frictions in other places. But thank you. Thank you. Did I have to say something more?